Welcome back to Sport Integrity Week, day 2. Remember, we've got a full programme of digital panels for you all the way from this afternoon right through until Friday. Morning session is coming to a close. We've got an excellent panel coming up in just a moment called Sustain the Game. Then we've got a short lunch break. And also this morning, well, it depends what time zone you're on. This afternoon, if you're on CET at 1 o'clock, you can also listen into how can women play a crucial role in the governance of South African sport. That's coming up after our next panel. I'll introduce you to the moderator in just a moment. But once again, a reminder that throughout the course of the day and week, you're going to see a QR code flashing up, or you can go to our social handles and there's a link for Eventbrite, and both of them have the purpose of allowing you to donate to SIGA. And in addition to a donation, you can also partake in a poll, and that allows you to say where you want the money to be spent. So you're not just helping support SIGA, which is, of course, a non-profit organization, but in addition to that, you're also defining the strategy of where the spending will actually be placed. And that includes things like a SIGA Youth Council and also funding towards events like this, which help us debate sporting integrity. So please do get involved. We encourage your questions via the app, and you can also use the hashtag SIW as well. And the great thing about these digital conferences are you can dial in and you can dial out. You don't even have to be fully clothed, so to speak. I know that one of our unnamed production staff has spent most of the morning in pajama bottoms, but a smart shirt. So that's the relaxed nature in this COVID-19 era. And please do engage and get involved. So let's move on to Sustain the Game now. That's our next panel, and it is powered by the Football Supporters Association. We'll be looking very broadly at how sustainable the current model of English football is, especially in light of COVID-19. The Football League has, of course, unfortunately lost Bury last season, and we've seen pretty worrying mismanagement at the likes of Wigan, Bolton Wanderers and Hull City, to name but 3 clubs. So stronger governance is perhaps needed, and maybe even more rigid checks before purchase. Our moderator for this panel to discuss some of these issues is the writer and broadcaster David Goldblatt. He wrote an excellent book called The Ball is Round, A Global History of Football, and he's been published, well, pretty much everywhere, but in particular The Guardian and the Financial Times. David, a very good morning. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us, and it's over to you for this panel and to introduce your panelists.
I think Dave, it's Mark Catlin, by the way, everyone. I think David may have dropped out. He had about 15 minutes when we was in the green room before, and he was having trouble with his internet connection. So should we just...
Ben, I wonder if you might want to introduce the panel, and then we could have 5 minutes each.
Yeah, absolutely. Delighted to. And why not start with yourself, David Conn, a writer for The Guardian and actually a moderator yesterday as well. David has written a number of seminal pieces and has focused in particular on investigative journalism as well. And he was one of the key voices in getting justice for the victims of the Hillsborough disaster, amongst other things. And before I introduce everyone else, David, let's just start with some of your opening remarks, because you can sort of tee this up for us, having followed a number of these key stories. Give me an overview of how you think COVID-19 has affected the sustainability of football clubs.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much for that introduction, Ben. I mean, obviously, the finances of English football have given not just people like me, but everybody, a lot of material, a lot of concern over the years, where we've lived through, or the game it has been enjoying by far the greatest boom in its history, beyond, billions beyond anyone could have imagined. The last TV deal that the Premier League had, the 3 years from 2016 to 2019, they got 8.6 billion for the 20 clubs in Britain, domestically from Sky, mainly from Sky and BT Sport, and around the world, huge deals from international broadcasters. And then people always talk about that it's a bubble and it's going to burst, but the current deals that they concluded for 2019 to 22 are actually bigger when you take in the international rights, which increased, even though the domestic rights went down a little bit. So 8 billion, or actually nearly 9 billion, between 8 and 9 billion for television money alone for just the 20 clubs of the Premier League. So through all these years of growth, it feels like we should never have been talking about clubs in trouble. We should never have been talking about a game in trouble in any way. We should never have been talking about smaller clubs. You mentioned Bury, Ben, 134 years old, 125 years a member of the Football League, close to my heart because I grew up 5 miles from the ground and used to go there as a kid, went to school in Bury. It's really, really sad and awful to think that there's no football being played at Gig Lane. The eras that it came through, I wrote one of my pieces for Guardian about Bury's collapse. Well, it survived 2 world wars. It came through the 30s. It was formed in 1885. There were hard times in the 1980s. To go out of business, to be expelled from the Football League in the greatest boom that the game's ever had, shows that something in the balance of it isn't quite right. So that was already the case. And obviously, credit to the Football Supporters Association that's just been digging in and campaigning on these issues for years and years, and obviously had a merger with Supporters Direct, so it now flies the flag for supporters trusts and for supporters trust democratic involvement in clubs. And there were already, as well as celebrating the great things about the game, concerns about these issues before the pandemic and before the shutdown, which obviously Mark will be able to talk about that from the sharp end, being the chief executive of a club himself. But you don't have to be any kind of investigative journalist to know that is a huge financial challenge. There was no football for however long it was, 3 months or so, and now there's no supporters in the ground, something that nobody could ever have foreseen. I think the key challenge for me, looking at it, is that obviously the Football League, the EFL, has been telling the Premier League that there's a £200 million hole, and the money is there for the Premier League to help out and make sure that no clubs actually collapse and go bust. But the Premier League has got its own, which I believe has been talking about it quite cooperatively and talking about a solution, but it's got its own challenges, and only last week had to terminate its deal with a company in China, which has defaulted on a lot more money than the 200 million that the EFL's hoping the Premier League will give it. So obviously, this is an additional extra challenge, but hopefully it's a short-term challenge that football will overcome collectively.
Intriguing points, in particular the last one that you made about that shortfall for many leagues and federations because of COVID-19, because of rights holders asking for rebates because of cancelled events and so on. And naturally, any club losing money at that end is going to be impacted. But Mark Catlin, CEO of Portsmouth Football Club, the revenue from fans in these empty COVID-19 stadia are felt even more acutely the lower down the league you go as well. So perhaps with a Premier League club, they would argue that the rights money is much more important than fan money and revenue on a match day. The lower down you go, and this extends obviously into League One, League Two, grassroots football, the more pain you feel at not having that day-to-day, week-to-week match day income. So give us your thoughts on how Portsmouth affected by COVID-19, how damaging it's been not to have things like that match day revenue, and how you've coped with this situation.
So luckily we was in a very good position financially going into this pandemic. We had £2 million of EBITDA profit last year, so we had some support there in the bank in regards of cash to ride it out. But to give you some round figures, these are $1 million either way, but just so that we understand it very simply, a club like Portsmouth has an annual turnover of £10 million. direct match day revenue in regards of corporate hospitality, tickets, season tickets, program sales, spin-offs such as the club shop, generates approximately 70% of that. So 7 million of our 10 million turnover is attributable directly to match day. And then you've got a lot of other added spin-offs that are causing problems at the moment in regards of sponsorships, where, you know, obviously with fans not in the stadium and we're not being able to give what we effectively sponsors signed up for, we're starting to get issues there as well. So I've openly said in the press, we're losing anything in the region of 600 to 700,000 pound per month directly as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And you are correct, as I'm sure David Conn knows better than myself, that when you're in the Premiership, your match day revenue and sponsors, percentage-wise of your total turnover is relative. It's sizable, but relatively small. By the time you get down into League One, League Two, your match day revenue becomes really the major source of revenue for you. And as you said, like all other clubs at the moment, we haven't got that coming in. It hasn't come in for the last 5 or 6 months. Those are the losses. Now, to help alleviate that, we have had some furlough help from the government. We've had the rates holiday, which has been very welcomed by all football clubs. And the clubs have had a lot of money via the Premier League and various authorities, you know, advanced to us. Nothing's been given to the clubs at the moment by way of a bailout, because it's money that we were already going to be due over the coming months anyway. And my concern at the moment, so for us at Portsmouth, if you look at the money we already had behind us following a few successful financial years, aligned with that money being brought forward, we are not feeling the pinch at this moment, because obviously as well, we have got a billionaire owner now in Michael Eisner. So we've got that support mechanism and we've got the cash flow forecast, and pretty soon we are going to be calling on him for assistance. And we're lucky to have that. A lot of other clubs may not have that. And a lot of other clubs moving forward as well. You know, we are going to be able to ride this out because we know we've got that support mechanism for money that would have been coming in during October, November, December via solidarity payments and distribution payments. You know, that won't come in, but we can rely on Michael and hopefully at some point as well, fans coming back into stadiums. So we're in it's been very damaging for us. You know, we're not on a life support machine as a business as such, but that's for a combination of different factors that don't apply to all clubs. But I do see, I always, just in a wider world as well, we're living in what I call a COVID economy at the moment that's not real. I fear for the greater economy as we come out of this as well. So given that combination, I think that something needs to be done, and quickly, or there's going to be some disasters along the way in the coming months.
Yeah, absolutely. David Goldblack is back with us. Delighted that we've been able to bring him in. David, I'm just going to fill you in and then I'm going to let you take over, because it is, of course, your panel. So David has given us a very useful overview of how he thinks football governance has been affected by COVID-19. Then we've just had, as you probably heard, the inside club perspective from Portsmouth. So Alison is probably going to be one of the next people to turn to, as well as, of course, as Tom, in terms of addressing how football fans feel and are being represented during this period, and of course what the government are doing and who they're working with. So I'm going to hand it back to you first, because you might have some opening thoughts and you might want to take it in a different direction, but we've certainly set this up nicely to determine where we're at because of COVID-19 and how the clubs are feeling. And now I'll hand it over to you, David, to bring in the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you very much. Really apologies, everyone. What can I say? Dodgy internet. David, did you speak about Wigan and Saudi Arabia earlier on?
Oh, actually, because you weren't there, I managed to get out of doing that, David, and I just went and did my own thing. So, and I've had my 5 minutes. I've had my 5 minutes now. So you're going to have to bring Alison and Tom in. And that's it. You've gone again. So I think I'm going to. See, that's it. They just don't have internet down south, do they? So I think I'm going to take over here. Alison, if this is the right way to introduce you as the shadow sports minister for Labour, if that's the right title, Alison's. Sorry, I wouldn't know the date that you were actually first elected, but you've been an MP a long time. It's for the constituent, is a Merseyside constituency, Alison, and also long-term football supporter and supporter of football in a political sense as well. So I'm sure everyone will be very interested to hear your perspective on these issues.
Thanks, David, and thanks, everybody. It is really interesting and great to hear from Mark as well about how it looks at the coalface. I just want to basically reflect a little bit on COVID and then talk about what I think the right approach is, which hopefully should not surprise anybody who's engaged with this discussion of football and the underlying principles on which it's run, and then say something just very briefly about the politics of all of that, because whilst sport, hopefully, ideally governments shouldn't interfere in sport. Sports should be able to run themselves. Actually, I think that there are some underlying political issues which I hope will help us move forward. So firstly, on COVID, in so many ways it's changed everything, and we've just heard from Mark, and I was very struck by his comments about the finances and the situation that Portsmouth are in, and lots of clubs are in a similar position. Not all of them have owners with deep pockets, and I think that is what has caused lots of people concern. But we shouldn't be too full of gloom, because whilst the finances are really, really challenging, and not all where football supporters, I think, have been relatively tolerant of the ups and downs of the situation. Not everybody's been able to know exactly what's going on all the time, and to be honest, it's been quite stop-start. Because I think that the government were really, really focused on getting the Premier League back on the television, and they weren't that focused on the grassroots game, getting people back playing, and getting the lower leagues properly underway in some form. And personally speaking, I think that was a mistake, and I think that football supporters have actually tolerated quite a lot of toing and froing, and not much information from the government about when they might be able to get back within a football stadium and watching some football. And obviously we're not there yet. So it's been very difficult. However, the negatives aside for 1 minute, I think football as a sport, and certainly supporters and people who go to games, ought to be very proud of themselves, because what I have seen from football clubs up and down the land is people using the identity and the spirit of being part of a football club to mobilise all kinds of things that their community has needed. So whether that is food deliveries to people who are shielding, or players, particularly Unity, as we know they are, and it's not just that they carry the brand of a place well beyond these shores. It's also that they are a key part in many places in our country of public services now. Lots of areas don't have youth clubs anymore. We don't have lunch clubs for older people in the same way as we used to. But what there often is a football club, and that football club has become part of social services, even where they're not contracted by the state. Often they're doing voluntary activity that would have once been done by the state. And I think that's incredible, and football should be really proud of it. Other sports do good stuff as well. It's just that the size and scale and trust in football clubs is such that they're able to do it, and it's amazing. So COVID has changed everything, but also, in my opinion, it's sort of changed nothing, in that if you look at the underlying trouble with football in terms of its governance and the regulation of it, we know David spoke about Bury before, and We've also obviously had other recent examples, Wigan and other things, where people might lose a loved football club due to, issues with finances and ownership, that whether triggered by COVID or not, that underlying issue of the fact that people who support a football club often have insufficient control over how it's run. That isn't changed by COVID. That was there already. We all knew about it. And I definitely knew about it because, as David said, I feel very old now. In the 10 years that I've been a member of Parliament, this governance and regulation and ownership and financial regulation of football has been an issue the whole time. As a Liverpool supporter, when I was first elected, a lot of the work I did in that early period was around the trouble that we had at Liverpool. And, this has been a constant issue. Tom and I served as Labour MPs together and did a huge amount of work. And the issues that Tom and I worked on, 8, 9, 10 years ago really haven't changed. So I'm just going to run through really quickly what I think those are before I get to kind of the politics, which I think we come to an interesting point. We do need a new regulatory approach for football. I lived through politically the re-regulation of the banking sector post the financial crash. And I think that if you look at the kind of responsibilities that we expect people to own and to accept those responsibilities, I think that it is about a new owners and directors test that isn't just a snapshot, that is proper and workable, but it's also about how we can together craft regulation that can change the culture in how football clubs are run. And I won't run through the worst examples because I think everybody pretty much knows them, but I think that we need a set of regulations that really drive a change in culture in terms of responsible ownership, management, and financial approach to football clubs. We obviously need a new ownership approach as well, and I'm a big fan of involving supporters. And it's fair to say that in 3 out of the 4 general elections that I've stood in, Labour's manifesto has had in it a new regulatory approach for football and a new ownership approach too. And the final thing that I think we all pretty much understand that we need now is a new approach to the pyramid as well, because there's too many cliff edges now. The parachute payments create kind of weird incentives, and in my opinion, they've created cliff edges that mean that competition, a proper football pyramid, where you can genuinely work your way to the top from the bottom, is undermined. So we need new regulatory approach, new ownership approach, and a pyramid that generally works. As mentioned before, and this is my final point, I mentioned before that in 3 out of the 4 general elections that I've stood in, Labour's manifesto policies have been around this approach to reviewing governance of football to try and get us to a better place. The thing that changed in 2019 was that the Tories said they'd have a review as well. So Boris Johnson put that in his manifesto. And when Keir Starmer asked me to be the Shadow Sports Minister, I spoke to the Sports Minister, and he and I both agreed that it was a really good idea. So I'm hopeful, perhaps I should be more cynical after 10 years of not seeing the changes that I feel like most people agree we need in football, but I'm hopeful that we can get cross-party agreement. And also I would be hopeful that we can get cross-stakeholder agreement too, because of course there will be details that will be hotly debated. But I think the idea of better regulation of football, that supporters should be proper stakeholders and not just consumers of football, and the idea that we need to make sure that competition really works in football. I don't think those things are controversial, and they're certainly not controversial in Parliament. I'm fiercely Labour, but I know Conservative colleagues who feel just as strongly as I do on this issue. So I hope that with some cross-party working over the next months, we can get this review underway from the government and get some movement and get things done. Because whilst I'm probably cynical more than most after 10 years in politics, actually, if we could get cross-party agreement, we might have half a chance of getting a reform that would stay for the long term. So that is my hope, and I'm really glad to be working with everyone on the panel to make that work.
Great, Alison, thank you. Am I back? Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
I do apologise about that. Thank you, Alison. You're making me feel so ancient. I feel like these issues are not 10 years old, but go all the way back to the Football Task Force in 1997, where we've been, nearly a quarter of a century of conversation on this. Tom, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, first of all, introduce to the audience who the Football Supporters Association are and where they sit in English football, and tell us a little more about Sustain the Game, which is your campaign, which addresses across the board all the issues that our speakers have been talking about.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the Football Supporters Association has existed for a year and a bit, but it is from the merger of Supporters Direct, which I was formerly the chair of, which was the sort of umbrella body for Football Supporters Trust and taken interest in governance, ownership and all those related issues, and the Football Supporters Federation, which had a broader overview of supporters' interests along a wide range of different issues. And we formed a single organisation a year and a half or so ago to try to make that voice stronger, more powerful, and to pursue the interests of football supporters. So, as everyone else has said on this panel, these are not new issues. They're issues that have been around for a long time. And Alison's already outed me as someone who used to have a different role in life. And during that time, we talked about a lot of the same things. And I think, just building on the sort of optimistic end to Alison's contribution just now, I think one of the interesting things around why now, and the reason why the FSA has effectively recalibrated these issues into the Sustain the Game campaign, is there is more interest now in sustainability in football than there has been for a while, is what we detect from clubs. It's not just supporters, and a range of different clubs at different levels. Increasingly vocal owners of clubs and people who are running clubs, so clubs like Tranmere and Accrington, for example, but others as well. And interestingly, just some signs in the football authorities, which historically, and we think of that history that you've referred to, David, from the Football Task Force onwards, have probably been best characterised as dragging their feet and hoping it would all go away. And to a certain extent, each time it sort of has, it's come in waves and never quite happened. Actually, I'm slightly more optimistic in that there are signs both with the FA and the EFL taking this much more seriously than there has been in the past. So that's the sort of reason why we've pulled all this together. I was looking earlier today just at some of the proposals that Supporters Direct worked on and the FSA took up in detail on some of the, what sits behind the campaign. And actually, they were first devised by taking account of a series of previous crises and issues around clubs. Bolton, 2.5 crises ago at Bolton, Coventry, Charlton, Hull, and working from the principle of, well, what would you do to prevent getting to these positions, to get to these crises? Because ultimately, I think what is in everybody's interest is having less crisis clubs and less crisis situations. But obviously, since then, what's happened in the last year, particularly with Bury, and David Cons talked about Bury, and the most, I think, heart-wrenching aspect of that was seeing the guy who is still technically the owner of Bury Football Club tour TV studios, almost boasting that he didn't know there was a football team in Bury when he bought it, and contrasting that with the fans living and or associated with Bury who've been going for years and suddenly had that just ripped out of their lives. That I think the situation at Bury, and an older club, other clubs that have gone out of business like Maidstone and Aldershot at various times haven't been as established, and as David Con said, have been through a long history and survived a lot and won the FA Cup and everything else that goes with it. And people like me that grew up in the south, probably only ever heard of Bury, but by the fact there was a football team, didn't know the town before that. And
you don't know what you're missing, Tom.
Yeah, I know. I've been there since.
Have you not heard of Bury Market, Tom?
I've been there now. And I've been to Hargreaves where they make the bicycles.
There you go.
Yeah, I know all about Bury now. So, that I think that really sort of started to change the attitudes a little bit. And then what's happened since then with Wigan, which isn't really about COVID, it's about actually the gaps, the inconsistencies, the lack of attention, and the framework which doesn't work has allowed that situation at Wigan to occur. And I think that's also become something which people just do not want to see being able to happen again. And, you start off talking about COVID and the COVID impact, and Mark talked about the impact. And Mark is lucky to be a chief executive at a club with an owner who has resources. But as he rightly said, there are many clubs that aren't in that position. And I think that presents an opportunity for the review that's been promised to happen and to put football in a much more sustainable future so he can protect and enhance clubs. And that's what Sustain the Game is about. It's about protecting clubs. It's about transparency and ownership. It's about the right type of financial controls. And, there are elements of that have been talked about, and there are different views on aspects of that, but there needs to be a complete package on that. It's about strengthening the pyramid. So the point you, David Cobb, made at the start about, the value, the amount of money that's in the game and has been in the game, and what's also happened at the bottom end of that pyramid, to get that in a much more sustainable position. And importantly, about supporter engagement, because whether supporters own clubs or have been owning clubs or are involved in, like in Portsmouth, the Heritage Board, or where you've got a shareholding, or what Wigan fans are trying to do to be in a position to potentially have that in the future, or even if you don't have a stake, but where fans, organisations and supporters are properly engaged with, that's when the clubs tend to be run better and run well and take a longer term view and avoid some of the messes that clubs that don't do it have got into. So that's what Sustain the Game's about. That's why now. And I think, all of us on here in one way or another are veterans of this. But I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we have an opportunity now to really make some change happen.
Great. Thank you, Tom. It occurs to me most of the conversation so far, quite reasonably, has been focused on smaller clubs, more precarious clubs, the lower divisions, where there are such enormous problems of governance. But one of the key football stories of the COVID moment has been the attempt by the Saudi Arabian sovereign fund to buy Newcastle United. And I just wanted to ask members of the panel whether you think the kinds of regulations, the kinds of transformations you're envisaging, would it make it easier to stop something like that happening? Should we be stopping something like that happening? I, for myself, find it deeply problematic that a foreign sovereign fund should buy a major English football club, but perhaps you think otherwise. Alison, what's the mood in Parliament on that issue?
I just want to separate out the issue of where people are from, because I think if we start down the road of saying, that we should criticise owners on the basis of where they're from, I don't think that's right, because I think that English football is part of a global game, and I think to me that's really important. That said, you make a different point, I think, David, which is about the nature of the ownership, and I think that is an entirely separate question, because I guess what the principle that I would want to go for is that owners should be, in the way that Tom just said, should be attending to supporters, their concerns, that we should be able to, one of the big concerns I think that supporters have is the tension between wanting your club to just do really well and win, and also, wanting your club to be sustainable. And when you talk to people whose clubs have collapsed or nearly collapsed, it's absolutely devastating for their life. So I guess the test I would set is, what kind of owners offer supporters medium to long term sustainability? After that, it's not for politicians like me to micromanage who can own football clubs. I would like to see a proper form of regulation that meant that those principles were delivered in reality from the point of view of ownership, that we had sets of owners whose behaviour was characterised by their interest and concern for supporters, and that that was matched with a financial stability over the medium to long term. And then I don't think it's for governments to pick and choose. There's obviously a foreign policy angle to the issue there as well, and I think people have rightly rightly have concerns. But if I'm honest, in terms of our engagement with whether it's what's happening in China or Saudi Arabia or other countries around the world, football's not special in that regard. There's lots of businesses where their interactions with countries that Britain has foreign policy issues to deal with on, where that will affect the way that they're able to do business. And I think we need to recognise that and be honest about it. But do I think that if I were the sports minister, I should be picking or choosing who owns Newcastle United? Very much not. But I do think that politicians have a duty to establish a system where those principles of responsiveness to supporters and genuine financial responsibility, not just meeting the minimum legal test, is met.
Great, thank you. Do any of the others of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, David. I mean, one of the aspects of the Newcastle drawn out takeover process that basically ended up with the Premier League, with the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund. What appeared to happen in the end was effectively pulling out after the Premier League had been asking them a series of questions, to the point where it began to look seriously like the Premier League would actually block the takeover. So I think it's important to realise that ultimately there was some governance there that looked like it was going to block that takeover by a Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth fund. But the reason for it was not because a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, had been murdered and dismembered in the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul, which is the heinous, infamous event which has obviously stained the image of Saudi Arabia across the world. I mean, that obviously there are other issues with Saudi Arabia, but that one act of infamy was not the one which the Premier League's owners and directors test didn't really have any role in sort of scrutinising that. But what ended up being the key issue was the piracy of TV rights of beIN, the Qatari-owned TV rights broadcaster, by the Saudi Arabian-run piracy operation. And I think although that seems weird and a real tale for our commercialised times, that it was the piracy of TV rights that did for that deal rather than any of the human rights issues, I think we should give some credit that there is some governance there. I mean, piracy of TV rights is still, very, very much outlawed. The word piracy tells you what it is, and that fell within the Premier League's governance remit, and in the end they took that really seriously, and people were saying they'll roll over, they won't have the nerve to stand up to something to the Saudi sovereign wealth fund, but it appears that they did. But another aspect that I think is that I found particularly I think is really significant, and I don't think should be overlooked, is that very significant Newcastle United supporters groups were in favour of that deal, including the trust. So the Supporters Trust, which is a very large trust, very long established, some great people involved, real campaigners, lovers of their club, didn't do what perhaps people outside of Newcastle would expect and say, well, Saudi Arabia is just not, a regime that we want coming anywhere near our football club. In fact, quite the opposite. Mike Ashley is a person whose regime they're, thoroughly sick of, and to them, it actually looked like a very viable alternative. And on the point about sovereign wealth funds and Gulf state sovereign wealth funds, well, they just look at Manchester City and they look at Paris Saint-Germain and say those deals have been allowed. That bridge has been crossed. So therefore, it's not really an issue anymore. That particular point, should you allow sovereign wealth funds, in effect countries, to take over football clubs that, as Alison was saying, are rooted in communities? Well, the answer is yes, that happens, the Newcastle fans were saying. So we can't really see that ours should be blocked on that basis. And they were looking at a very well-resourced, obviously, regime that was also promising to regenerate and invest in Newcastle itself. And they were very, very positively behind that deal. So one thing which I'd be really interested in asking Mark about is that Portsmouth has obviously been through the same issue, that Portsmouth had horrendous problems up to 2010, became the first and only Premier League club to go into administration, an incredible series of ownership calamities. And then the trust did manage to take over the club, didn't it? And it was a beacon for supporter ownership. But obviously,
Can I just come in here? Forgive me. I've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience, and I'd just like to bring those into the conversation.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Mark about the flip from being supporter owned to being owned by the billionaire Michael Eisner, because at the time they saw that as more sustainable than being owned by the trust.
Shall we take questions? And do you want me to answer that very
briefly, if you would?
As briefly as I can. Obviously, I was involved in helping with the trust and our presidents in Save the Club in 2012, 2013. Came out, stayed on as chief executive, went through that. We wish, even now with Michael as our owner, who's the best owner we could wish for, I wish that all clubs were fan-owned and run self-sustainably. But unfortunately, trying to keep up with other clubs and the demands of fans who, in their own way, are to blame for a lot of the issues at the clubs by the demands, especially now on social media, that they put on owners, put on chief executives, put on managers to drive that success, irrelevant of the cost of it. That's something to be wary of as well. But the main issue for us that was needed at Portsmouth, and why we really had the choice at that time to pick the best owner we could in Michael coming in, which is, by the way, I think the best thing that's happened to the football club in its history, is that our stadium was literally falling to pieces. We were struggling to keep a capacity up. It needed £5 million spent, in a 5-year period, and we just couldn't do that and remain competitive in League One and keep going. And on reflection now with COVID, that turned out to be a very wise choice, because given that need to spend that money added to now what we'd be losing, I really would fear for the club if we didn't have Michael behind us.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I've got a question here from Oliver Hines, who's watching us. I think this brings a number of themes we've been talking about together. I'll put it to you, Tom. Clearly, we need the owners and directors test and regulations to be changed, to be tougher, to be more all-embracing. I think we all agree on that. Can you relatively concisely say actually what that would look like? Who would be doing the regulating? On what basis? How tough would it be? Is it just the FA? Is it the Premier League? Who's going to be in charge of the new regime?
Well, yeah, from the FSA perspective, we think that regulation should be independent of the leagues, because the leagues are effectively the clubs. So there is self-interest baked into that, and sometimes that affects the integrity of some of the decision making, or certainly where it's coming from. So we want to avoid that compromise happening on an ongoing basis. So our suggestion would be that would be something which, as with every other, or pretty much every other UEFA nation football authority does, that's the FA as the governing body, but it could be somewhere else. And Damien Collins, for example, has floated a different idea about how you do it. The important thing is that it's independent of the leagues. And on the owner and directors test and those issues around that sit around that, it's taking that from being, as Alison referred to earlier, a snapshot in time, almost tick box exercise, to enabling ongoing monitoring and awareness. And the real prize in that is that if things start to go badly, you can pick it up early, and you can pick it up and deal with it with reference to clubs that are able to do it better or well, or take into account best practice, so that you avoid the crises. That's the fundamental point in this. What we want to be in a position is that we don't have the crisis clubs and the situations like, where Portsmouth was 10 years ago, or where where Wigan seem to be at the moment. We want to avoid those things, and a good way of insulating against that is by having that oversight, which is ongoing and continually monitored, rather than just being at the point at which someone decides to or manages to conclude a transaction in buying a club.
And do you think at the moment the FA has the kind of auditing and organisational capacity to really do the job? Because when we're talking about a proper fit and proper persons test, you need to do some serious due diligence in this world, to actually find out really what people are up to. It's not easy. Rich and powerful people hide their stuff. So I just wonder, do we need to be funding that? What sort of scale of kind of investigative and auditing capacity will that regulator need?
Yeah, no, the FA as it stands doesn't have that capacity or capability. So that's something that would need to be addressed. The FA, I sit on the FA Council, and the FA does regulate lower leagues, but that's obviously much simpler in many regards for the reasons you've just outlined. So it would need to be something which has the right capacity to do it properly. And so it is a significant change. And the FA's corporate perspective is they can sort of see that there are issues with regulation, but at the moment it's not going to happen. But they're not going to volunteer to do it, and you're not going to find the league saying, "Oh, great, you want to do that? Here you go, get on with it." It's going to need that other political push, which is part of the early discussion to make that happen, I think.
Great, thank you. A question from Rustam Sethna on salary caps, and again, in getting a little bit more detailed and practical. One of the main crises that besets football clubs is they spend too much money on wages. The solution is often said to be some kind of salary cap or wage control. We do have that in League 1 and 2 at the moment. Mark, I wonder, what do you make of the current salary cap models that we have? And if they don't work, what would you like to see happening?
So we've been at the vanguard really since we came out of administration in self-sustainability, but self-sustainability doesn't always equate to salary cap. So the current rules in League 1 at 2.5 million, we can self-sustain at 4.5 million, and that's roughly where we are as a football club. But at 2.5 million, there's plenty of clubs that can only self-sustain a player budget of $1 million. So they're still losing $1.5 million to get to 2.5 million, while we are being brought down for what we can afford down to the £2.5 million level. We just feel that is totally unfair. And in all instances, I mean, even now, the thing that's very upsetting for me, shock horror, David will probably write a story about this at some point, but some of the clubs that pushed heavily for salary cap at the 2.5 million, and we're sticking rigorously to that. Our books are there, come and audit them whenever you want. Yeah. The upsetting thing is some of the clubs that push for it, we're hearing a lot of rumours behind the scenes now that they're doing lots of things to try and circumvent it to get one over on clubs like Portsmouth and Sunderland and Ipswich that can afford more. So that's really, really disappointing. So
how do they try and circumvent it, Mark?
Well, there's quite a few things you can do. You can pay, as an example, one of the things I've been told is going on, you can pay a transfer fee. By the way, these are rumours, agents, other clubs telling me, so none of this has been proven or verified. But I have asked the EFL to look into it, and the EFL are, apparently monitoring everything that's going on. So you could pay, let's say, £1 million to another club for the player. The transfer fee is outside of the salary cap, and then that club pays off that player by, say, £300,000 on that. That player then goes to the new club, gets a 3-year deal, and that £300,000 is amortised over the term of the contract, which equates to £2,000 a week, which you add on to the salary cap figure. So effectively, the player's getting it, but he's getting in a lump sum advance that's been paid via a transfer fee. Right. So we are all for, and in any of these rules, you've got to bring in, it's no good relying on a couple of people at the EFL to monitor this. We have to support it financially, police it, monitor it in real time, not wait so that the indiscretion happens in a certain year. That club, by cheating, and that's the word for it, then gets promoted, and then they're trying to deal with it 2 years down the line. It has to be dealt with there and then. And to this day, and I'm a big fan of Rick Parry, Dave Baldwin, the EFL and all the other clubs, but I think there's a demand from the clubs that we need to see implemented, that if any club is in breach of the regulations, and there's a cap there now of 2.5 million, and then there's a 5% luxury tax overspill if you go over, where you're given a bit of flexibility. But for me, if you then go £1 over that, you are in breach of the regulations and you do not get promoted that year. That just kills it.
Mark, when you're saying, it's very interesting because it's the first real detail that I've heard about the salary cap, which is, it's a major move for football, isn't it? We've never had an actual salary cap before. No. And suddenly, it looked to me, in large part because of Wigan and because of Bury, that suddenly recognising that clubs were just overspending to the point where they were in danger of going out of business. We suddenly went from, there are flaws in the current model, which the Bury case clearly showed, that the model that they had, which was 50% of turnover can be wages, but the owner can put money in on top of that, just didn't work, because then the Bury owner went into financial difficulties himself, and that's what led to the club's collapse. So yours is the first time I've heard the argument about salary caps, and I really take the point, obviously, that you're saying you can afford to spend more than that, and some clubs can't. So why have an arbitrary figure in the middle? But just from your point of view, in terms of clubs that are always not overspending, but spending for players to compete to try and get promoted, do you think that's going to restrict the bigger clubs? And how are you going to adjust to the fact that you can't outspend now the smaller clubs to get promotion as one of the big clubs in League One? What are you going to have to do? Is it going to mean that the clubs are going to have to be smarter in terms of coaching and on the field because you're restrained in terms of spending?
Yeah, well, number one, it's bizarre. I'm agreeing with the PFA here. I'm still hoping that the PFA managed to get some concessions, and I don't want to see the salary cap abolished. I think with some adjustments, and one of the things that we've put forward pre the vote was that clubs, their net gate receipts, and that's a process each and every club goes through after each and every league game. So we are all used to filling in net gate receipt forms that go to the EFL. So all we've said is the 2.5 million, great, as a cap for clubs that can't afford to get there, they're allowed to go up to that. But any amount beyond that, owners can't put the money in. It has to be on net gate receipts, because I think it's totally unfair that you're asking like 20,000 each week at Portsmouth Football Club, with the great respect, to compete with clubs at 2,000 or 3,000 who the expectation and the aspirations of those relevant fan bases are just totally two different things. Our fans will not accept for long periods, and I won't name some of the clubs because it's disrespectful to them, but to be losing players to the smaller clubs because the cost of living, for example, is cheaper up north than it is down south. And that is
you there, Mark, if I can. Tom, you wanted to come in on this.
Just very, very quickly. I think the PFA document which they put in when this was being discussed was really actually very good. It wasn't just about self-interest in the PFA, looking at particularly the parallels it drew with changes in regulation in other sports. Now, you could cynically say, well, that's just about trying to delay something. But I think actually they've got some really good points there about the way in which you do this to try to avoid some of what Mark's just described as rumoured ways in which people are going to try and get around it. But the main point is, look, a salary cap on its own isn't going to do the job. It has to be part of a wider suite of measures that are about sustainability. And you can't have it only in two divisions when you've got a division below it or a different league below it and a division of the same league above it, because then what you do potentially is you set up in a situation where there's a complete disparity between those different leagues, and you then undermine the ability for people to be promoted and relegated and the integrity of the game from that perspective. So on one hand, whilst it was good to see that the background to this seemed to be about taking some of these issues seriously, I think the proposed salary cap and the way it's been brought in and the speed in which it's been brought in risks undermining that wider approach. And I think it needs to be part of something much wider and broader if it's going to have the desired impact.
I mean, I think it's important. The thing that's upset us is, what is this about? Is it about sustainability of the clubs, which we've been at the vanguard and the flag bearer for the last 7 years, or is it about levelling the playing field? You know, if everyone on this call believes that a club with 2,000 should compete with someone that's getting 40,000 every week, then, you know, we're going down an American model. But the American model is different because they don't have promotion and relegation. So I think that's totally unfair. And as I say, the other thing that I argued for was if owners that can't afford to get to 2.5 million, then they should have to put a bond in. If this is about sustainability and clubs not going bust, why are we allowing owners still to put in? I mean, I dare say, David, under the Bury, they can't get to 2.5 million. You might have still ended up with a Bury situation.
For a small club, that's huge money.
It's huge money.
So I understand your point. You're saying that still sanctions overspending.
Yes.
Including by an owner. For a small club. So the salary cap doesn't actually do the job.
And they've taken away SCMP, which was the mechanism to try and control that now. So completely uncontrolled.
That was the previous model under which Bury did collapse, which was 50% in League Two of turnover could be spent in wages, but owners could put the money in a short-term way. And that led to the collapse of Bury, as I said earlier. And really that it ended the credibility of that system, didn't it, Mark? It still relied on owner funding.
It did.
Or it enabled it.
Yeah, what we have argued for is, if you're going to show let's just round figures. Let's just say, use a Bury as an example, that can afford a 1.5 million player budget and be self-sustaining. Why don't you say you could go to 2.5 million? Yeah, because we don't want you spending crazy throwing everything out of kilter for the rest of the league in regard to player wages. Yeah, so we accept that argument. But if you're going to accept the fact you're going to be losing £1 million a year, the difference between 1.5 million, 2.5 million on the cap, you have to put it in as a bond at the start of the season, so everyone knows that the club's going to be safe for the term of that player's contract. That's the difference between the 1.5 and the 2.5 million. And then the clubs that go,
Mark, forgive me, I really need to pull you up here. Forgive me, I've got another question from the audience. We don't have a lot of time left. We're going to just have to pass on the details of that. This is a question from Anton. I think it sort of speaks to us all, but I'm going to take it to Alison first. And he asks, what kind of difference can campaigns like the FSA's Sustain the Game, bottom-up campaigns, how can you actually influence policy making? So where are the pressure points where fans individually and collectively through their trusts and so on actually make a difference? What's the way to actually push change in your experience?
Well, I think that obviously supporters can make a difference, and it sort of goes back to where I was at the beginning, which is that what I've seen over COVID and the crisis is people mobilising that sense of identity in support of a cause. And so I would be very keen to see groups of supporters, fighting for the particular cause that they believe in, making their voices heard in a collective way, and using their, independence and organisation to influence their political process. I think we've seen some pretty amazing examples of that. Parliament is probably more influenced by public petitioning than it has ever been, given the kind of systems that we have now, which certainly wasn't the case kind of much earlier you were talking, David, about the football task force and when these issues were looked at 20 or 30 years ago. Parliament, I think, is more responsive, and I think football supporters are able to mobilise around a particular issue and use, whether it's kind of newer social media techniques or whether it is, like, as I say, fairly traditional method of petitioning, but using kind of some of the new systems that we have to get those in politics to respond. In the end, though, I think it's very good for supporters to campaign, but I think what's even better is the work that the FSA do, which is to try to put a structure behind supporters and to try and organise them as independent organisations so that they can have a authoritative view about the interests of supporters in a particular club. And I think you see that on day-to-day match day issues. We could have a similarly long conversation about all the rules and regulations that exist around football as a sport that don't exist around going to watch other sports, for example. And over those kind of like really important match day things, supporters can be powerful with the right structures in place and where the organisations have been created, whether it's a supporters trust or simply a supporters association that allows people to be involved. And then I think to politicians, those organisations have real credibility. I feel like I've answered that in quite a waffly way. I want to think of a really good concrete example of that demonstrates it. But I think, we all can think of campaigns at our own clubs where a well-organised group of supporters can get heard now, and we need to build on that.
An example that comes to mind, if I may, and this leads to another question, is Hull City, where at one point the owners wanted to change the name to Hull Tigers on the grounds that City, I believe, was a shit name. I wonder, is there? We've talked about.
I'm not quite sure if the case was made in that way, David.
We've talked about regulation. We've talked about the minutiae of salary caps. I wonder, is there a role for actually changing the law in some areas as it regards football? And for example, we talk about football clubs as community assets. Do we need it on a legislative basis that you can't change their name or you can't change their colours? Where do you see legislation, Tom, in your list of priorities and instruments for bringing about change?
Well, I think on the issues around names and grounds and proposals to relocate clubs and those things that we've seen examples of in our collective past on these things, I think that is where there is a significant gap. Our proposal for this in the paper that we put together was looking at effectively a code of practice on stewardship. So that would sit with the regulatory regime that we're talking about, rather than necessarily in actual sort of legislation, but that will protect that broad range of things. Because that Hull example, or when Cardiff at one stage changed their shirts from blue to red and they went back again, and changing the badge and those types of things, they're all emotive and important issues for supporters because they're about the heritage and identity that we talked about earlier. And I think sometimes they're a bit overlooked as being important in this, but they are important in this because they, I think, are real signals of that community asset sort of idea. So, our view is that needs to be protected, that, clubs in their communities need to be protected in a way, because clubs they're not just like any other business or even any other leisure business. They're more important than that. And Berry gives you that, the most recent, I think, example of what happens when that isn't protected. But our proposals look at that as part of that code of practice.
So how does a code of practice work? Forgive me. How does that have teeth, falling short of the kind of what you can do if you've got a piece of law? How does that actually work?
So, what we're proposing or propose is that in those types of issues, there has to be a framework of any consultation. If there are any proposals to change it, they can't just happen at the whim of an owner. So there are certain features around clubs which are therefore protected. So you might have, for an example, a situation like Brentford, for example, where actually it is in the interest of everybody, supporters included, that they're quite content to move from Griffin Park to their new ground, whatever it is, half a mile away, because it suits what they want to do. So doesn't mean that you can't do it, but you wouldn't be able to do something like that without there being the degree of consensus and support from the supporters and other stakeholders to make sure it happens. And you can't be in a position where, for example, you say you're going to move and you sell your ground before you can move to another one. Those types of things, I think, are really important where the protections should lie. But we see that as being something which is best done through that overall regulatory approach that we've talked about already, rather than being primary legislation, particularly directed towards that. But as all these things, are all open for debate.
David, if I may just interrupt, this is exactly sort of the point that I was trying to make earlier, in that we found in the new regulations to govern banking after the crash, that you could change the rules and regulations and you could change the law, and the people who wanted to act responsibly might think that those rules were good or bad or whatever, but they would go into it in the right spirit. But the most difficult thing for legislators and for politicians to do is not to change the law, really. We can write whatever we want in an act, in theory. The hard thing is changing the culture. And the question we've got to ask ourselves, and what the government's fan-led review should ask itself, I think, is what's the right broad set of rules and regulations that work to create the kind of national game that we want to have, but also will generate an honest conversation about the culture that exists in owning and managing running football, and allows those owners and those who are managers in clubs to lead that conversation about changing the culture. Allied to that is then supporters being empowered to have their voice heard and to engage with clubs, so we get that productive culture that will improve the game. Because no rule or regulation that we write will be good enough, that nobody can ever subvert it if they really want to. What we need is a kind of cultural shift, as much as anything.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We're already 10 minutes over, which is testament, I think, to how engaging this has been. One last question, one last issue to sort of all of you, and that's the issue of transparency. I mean, part of the problem in all of these conversations, we're not dealing with, we haven't got the information. We haven't got people's books open. We don't know who actually owns clubs or owns the companies that owns clubs and so on. And David, often as an investigative journalist, you must run into that problem. So I wonder, what sort of change in the transparency regulations around football would make a real difference to the better governance of the game in England?
Okay, I think as this is our final remark and we've got to be brief, actually the answer to that question is that's not a huge problem in English football. Generally, we know who the owners are. That was something that was an issue years ago, but I think there is actually quite a high level of transparency now. Mm-hmm. Now, just from my perspective, having this conversation, when we talk about the Football Task Force, which was 22, 23 years ago, I was very involved with that. So I can feel a bit of a grumpy old man in these discussions. And I remember Alison in her early days in Parliament doing a panel with her. And I was a bit of a grumpy old man then, saying, oh God, we've been talking about this for years. And now she's saying, oh God, we've been talking about this for years, because she's been at it 10 years now. And I think I'd been at it 10, 15 years by that time. But
are you calling me a grumpy old woman, David?
Alison, don't take it the wrong way. It's all good experience. But I think rather than be grumpy about it, I think there's grounds for optimism. So at that time, the Football Task Force, there were barely any rules and regulations. And out of that came Supporters Direct. And now we've had this movement of Supporters Trust, and came the 5% that was invested in the grassroots by the Premier League. There was no owners and directors test. And now there is quite a relatively strong process for takeovers that should be strengthened. There was no financial regulation to speak of, and now there is financial regulation. Mark has got a strong argument for whether it's right or wrong, but there's a strong amount of financial scrutiny. And supporters groups, Supporters Trusts, and the FSA and Supporters Direct, now merged, have played a huge role in all of that, in actually a great evolution of stronger governance for the overall health of the game. And it is continuing. And it seems like in these very, very difficult times, there's grounds for optimism that it's being taken even more seriously, because it's concentrating people's minds.
Wicked, man. It's very often rarely one ends on such a positive note of optimism in these debates. But I think I just thought I would. As they say in football, we'll take the positives from this performance. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, David. Thank you, Seeger, for putting this on. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And thanks very much for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hello everyone and greetings from Budapest, Hungary.
Hello from Kosovo.
My name is Jerice Cologne.
My name is Rusa.
I'm Ian Smith.
Cameron Casoglis.
Edwin Moses.
My name's Aki Sheikh and I'm Head of Starness and Integrity Services here in London, England.
I'm Senior Manager of Member Associations Governance Services at FIFA.
Integrity is the bedrock of all competitive sport. Without it, there is nothing.
By definition, it is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles.
Integrity is surely one of the most significant elements in sports.
As a cricket umpire, one of the most important tasks for any umpire is to make sure the decision making is as efficient as possible. This can only be possible if umpires work with integrity.
Perhaps now more than ever, we recognize the importance of this vision for sports and the need for integrity in every aspect of sport.
We are a member of SIGA, and not only because we believe in integrity in sports, but to the fact that we believe in coalitions and collective efforts to achieve change.
We all know that sport is one of the most powerful things on the planet for bringing about societal change, and we all want to be part of that, and we want you to be part of it, and we absolutely all need to do it together.
This is a task none of us can achieve on our own. It is one that all of us must achieve together.
I believe that together we're stronger.
Together, united, we can effect positive change by developing and promoting integrity principles and values.
I would like, first of all, to praise SIGA's leadership in the persons of its chairman and its CEO for having had the courage to organize this event under the current circumstances.
Thank you to SIGA for the work that you do for sports integrity and for the example your independent rating and verification systems for the world of sports.
Organisations such as SIGA, who are there to make standards better and to uniform all the standards throughout the industry, are needed.
SIGA is unavoidable and unrivaled organization with unrivaled role in the field of the integrity of the sport.
I think this first Integrity Week is very important.
ISST is proud to be associated with the SIGA movement.
I am proud to partner with the Sport Integrity Global Alliance and participate in this year's Sports Integrity Week.